Well, thank you. And thank you, Peter and Kate, for hosting this and inviting me to participate. It's obviously timely, always timely, increasingly timely to be talking about these intersectionalities of energy and power and climate. And I think the book I'm going to talk about is a non-academic book, so it's really a publicly accessible book, which is a new, I'm in a place in my career where I can do kind of a different kind of work with a different kind of impact. So it's been fun to be able to explore and talk and connect some of the dots that in a way that's aligned with a lot of academic theory, but also quite empirical, I guess, as well, and hopefully having an influence in a political sense. So I wrote this book right before the pandemic, and it was released September of last year. And it's really based on my own experience as working in climate and energy over my whole career, so the past 20, 25 years, and realizing what we're seeing right now in COP in Glasgow elevated just how insufficient and inadequate really our responses to the climate crisis are, given that we know we need to phase out fossil fuels and move toward a renewable-based future, but we have been unable to do that, right? And there are a lot of reasons why we have been unable to do that. But one of the reasons that I've recognized, and what this book kind of talks about, is who has the power and who's being included and who's being excluded and whose voices are we listening to, and the basic argument is that we will be unable to make the transformations that are needed until and unless we prioritize social justice and equity and vulnerabilities and investing in people and communities more explicitly. So that's kind of the basic argument. So I'm going to walk through the different sections of the book and also connect it with some other more recent research. And then I'm hoping to leave plenty of time for discussion. So look forward to your comments and reflections and questions. So I begin by just saying who I am, so you have a sense. I'm actually, I haven't considered myself a geographer, mostly because—
Geographer?
Yeah, cool.
Sorry, there's some weird audio thing going on. But mostly because the places where I've been trained, the universities where I was trained, didn't have geography. So I didn't know really the field of geography, but I've been welcomed and, a part of the geography community, definitely throughout my career more recently. So I was born and first lived in Dublin, Ireland. My family moved to the Boston area when I was 8. I always had a focus on environment and had an environment science and policy degree first, and then did a quite technical degree in environmental science and engineering. Knew I wanted to get more in the social science, so did a postdoctoral research more on kind of energy policy. And then I was at Clark University, which has a very strong geography department. And although I wasn't in the geography department, and there kind of developed a transdisciplinary research portfolio on energy and climate and kind of the integration of social and technical dimensions. I then taught at University of Vermont for a couple of years, and then to Northeastern, where I am now, which is a very kind of innovative, entrepreneurial, transdisciplinary university. So it's worked well for me to be there. So I want to begin by connecting climate and energy with economic injustice and the growing concentration of wealth and power This figure is just from the United States pre-pandemic. This same patterns are emerging in lots of countries and globally as well. And during the pandemic, it has gotten even worse. So this is actually not even the billionaires have even more concentrated wealth and arguably power as well. They're really influencing so much of what we do in our policy space, in our institutions, our priorities and practices. And so I like to connect with Dario Kenner's work, calling out the polluter elite, those that are profiting from fossil fuels in particular, who are really actively and strategically for decades investing to resist the transformation away from fossil fuels toward a more renewable-based distributed energy system. So those investments, we don't know that, a lot of people don't know that much about how intentional those investments have been, but really decades of investing in misinformation campaign to deny climate science. So people are confused about the realities of the climate risks, and then also investing to undermine public trust in government, which has allowed, as we all see now, a rise in autocratic and really a weakening of democracy in many places. And then also minimizing worker protections and worker rights. It used to be that corporations were proud of how they treat their workers, whereas now many corporations, there's been kind of cultural shift. A lot of corporate culture really now focuses on shareholder interests and minimizes the workers, and how much we need to pay workers. So I propose that the climate crisis in this backdrop is really a crisis in leadership. And I point out, and I reference this idea of climate isolationism, which is kind of this narrow technocratic lens of thinking about climate in isolation of other issues. A lot of climate policy is just focused on greenhouse gas emission reductions and decarbonization and very quantitative assessments of those goals. And that's what we see, even in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at the COP. Sorry, there's some audio. I think, Peter, maybe could you mute yourself?
It's not me, but
there's a
okay.
And I think we're the idea of by focusing on climate in this kind of technocratic way, we're missing a lot of opportunities for a more holistic perspective and really missing opportunities for kind of improving the human condition by acknowledging how integrated climate is with everything else. So I propose an alternative framework thinking about the climate crisis within an energy democracy lens, which is really moves away from climate and really thinks about the need to end fossil fuel reliance and shift to renewable energy, but acknowledging that there's so many benefits of doing that have nothing to do with climate, and that this is an opportunity to base investments on social justice and human dignity, and really focus on people and communities, and leveraging the urgency of the climate crisis for this larger transformation. And one of the things that isn't always clearly articulated when we talk about energy is why it's so revolutionary and transformative, the renewable energy transformation, is because every single community in the world has access to renewable resources, whether it be sun and wind, or coastal communities have access to offshore wind and wave and tidal energy. Onshore communities also have access to geothermal energy, which has been underinvested in. So if you think about the distribution of energy resources, and that every community actually has local, regional, a mix of renewable resources, you can imagine a future where our systems are really a regionally appropriate mix of renewables that really distributes power literally and figuratively. And the other thing about renewables that is so transformative is that they're available very reliably, perpetually, abundant, forever, and the resource itself is free. And so that is why it's so transformative compared to our current centralized fossil fuel-based extractive and exploitative energy system. So the first chapter of my book is called Growing the Squad, and it really talks about this different kind of leadership and that acknowledges the power dynamics that are problematic, that are advantaging some and disadvantaging others over and over again in a legacy and systemic way. And the squad are these 4 junior congresswomen in the United States that came on the national stage just 2.5 years ago. And they have just transformed the discourse and or been part of or contributed to the changing discourse about climate and energy policy by connecting climate and energy to the housing crisis, to jobs, and not just jobs in general, but jobs for people who have been from communities that have been underinvested in for so long, and connecting climate and energy also to structural racism, and as I mentioned, also the housing crisis and transportation issues. So this kind of leadership, which I call anti-racist feminist leadership, I use those words to really just reflect leadership that is constantly aware of and resisting these problematic power dynamics that are so prevalent in so many of our systems. So this kind of leadership is based on collaboration, inclusivity, and participation. It's focused on distributing wealth and power rather than concentrating wealth and power, by prioritizing investments in communities and workers. And it's really about reducing inequities and disparities by centering economic justice, racial justice, social justice, and leveraging transformation by linking problems together rather than keeping problems in isolation and separating them. So obviously the antithesis of anti-racist feminist leadership is this conventional, traditional, patriarchal leadership that is very intentionally excluding people, and it's concentrating wealth and power, focused on maintaining or sustaining or perpetuating those who already have power to get more wealth. And it's really prioritizing investments to maximize corporate profits, and it relies on exacerbating inequities and disparities. And the only way for this kind of power to persist is actually by denying the problems that we have. So we see denial of the climate crisis, we see denial of the pandemic being as dangerous as it is, we see denial of an economic crisis and the precarity that so many people live in, we see denial of, across the board of a housing crisis, of all kinds of issues. So what the rest, the structure of the book is really, in a sense, almost anecdotal stories of really inspiring, innovative leaders that are courageous and creative in how they're approaching and connecting climate and energy policy with other issues. So the first one chapter is about leaders who are resisting the polluter elite, and I mentioned Jackie Patterson, who's the leader, the head of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program in the NAACP, and she has really been a leader in articulating how the fossil fuel industry in the United States has particularly manipulated Black communities to get compliance and acceptance of industrial and fossil fuel infrastructure in those communities, even though it ends up having negative health impacts and other impacts for those communities. Another leader is here in Massachusetts, our Attorney General, the lawyer. She calls herself the people's lawyer. She has used our consumer protection laws to sue ExxonMobil for greenwashing by saying that fossil fuels that they're selling are green. And I also mentioned here Indigenous women who are resisting solar geoengineering research. I take a little bit of a detour here. This is mentioned in the book, but I've become more recently engaged on this issue of solar geoengineering because it is elevating in the discourse of climate, that we could get to such a state that we might actually want to be injecting aerosols into the atmosphere to cool the planet, right? And I've done quite a lot in the past year or so, really writing and speaking up again about the dangers of investing in solar geoengineering research, because it perpetuates some of these same problematic power dynamics, and it creates one more mechanism for billionaires or one billionaire or one country to really try to control and manipulate the whole rest of the whole world. So the injustices associated with that are really stark, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. But it's mentioned in the book, but I've actually been doing more kind of advocacy work than anything else, because it's not really, in some sense, it's not really research, but it's I think really important policy work. So the next chapter of the book is really about leaders who are connecting climate and energy with jobs and economic justice. And Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, is one of the leaders who has worked with and responded to by connecting climate policy with the economic precarity that we've become kind of complacent to almost, and really thinking about jobs and economic justice connecting with climate justice. And Varshini Prakash is one of the co-founders of the Sunrise Movement, which is the youth movement that has perpetuated and really advocated for a very different kind of climate policy. Several other leaders that I talk about in the book are leaders who are really thinking about the workforce, and it's not just jobs, numbers of jobs, but who gets access to those jobs, who's trained in those jobs. So several leaders who are thinking about and engaging on issues of making sure that the jobs that are created are distributed among those who really are in need of them. So this whole chapter really talks about those who are resisting the precarity that we've become complacent with, reclaiming the possibilities of big public investments and a restructuring for more inclusive prosperity. So I mentioned here a recent research paper that I wrote with, co-authored with some students, and this project actually emerged from a class project, and the students we looked at Green New Deal proposals at multiple levels and jurisdictions. There's the EU policy, there's New York has a state policy, Boston has a proposed Green New Deal policy, as well as the national level initial Green New Deal, and there are various different proposals for Green New Deal like policies, and they're really emerging as a new kind of way to think about that moves away from the decarbonization, greenhouse gas emission reduction, narrow way of thinking about climate, and really thinking about it as an opportunity to invest in new ways. So the next chapter in the book is about leaders who are connecting climate and energy with health and well-being and nutritious food for all. In this chapter, I talk about Robert Bullard, who is often considered the father of environmental justice, among the first to kind of do research to demonstrate how Black communities in particular in the United States are disproportionately exposed to health risks associated with industrial and fossil fuel infrastructure. Mildred McLean is among many Black women who've been reiterating that they are sick and tired of being sick and tired. I mentioned Gina McCarthy, who is a leader who is currently the White House National Climate Advisor, She was also the head of the EPA under the Obama administration, but she, throughout her career, has been calling for climate to be presented as a public health issue, and really connecting the links with health. And in response, communities around the world some have now declared the climate crisis a public health emergency. Julian Hishaw is a leader in a lawyer who is advocating and connecting climate energy policy with Black farmers and agriculture. Mustafa Santiago Ali is a leader who's speaking up about the disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities on the risks of climate change and the climate impacts that are disparate. And Dorcetta Taylor is a researcher who was among the first to point out how white the United States environmental movement is. And how it impacts. And I mentioned here Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand, as a leader that kind of takes the particular, during the pandemic, illustrated, evidence-based, strict measures for public health, but then communicating kind of with compassion and empathy to explain to people that these measures are needed not just for your own health, but for the health of your community and even the country. And that's kind of a different approach of leadership. And the next chapter is about leaders who are connecting climate and energy with transportation and transit justice. Representative Ayanna Pressley is one of the members of the squad, and she is the representative who represents me here in Boston and Massachusetts and Cambridge. And she has really been a leader in highlighting that transportation investments really, we need to be thinking about transit justice issues and the equity and the distribution of those investments. And a lot of our transportation investments have perpetuating inequities rather than the opposite. Michelle Wu is just got elected here in Boston on Tuesday. She is going to be our new mayor. She'll be signed in a couple of weeks. And she came up with the most detailed Green New Deal proposal that we found in our research. And it really connects, and it includes making the subway, the MBTA, the transit system in Boston free. That's part of her proposal. And this is considered, radical and unimplementable by many, but she is bringing very progressive values and calls for big investments in how we finance different kinds of infrastructure, including our public transit system. And I mentioned Greta Thunberg in this chapter just as a leader who has demonstrated some innovative issues related to transportation when she came over to North America for the previous climate conferences. She traveled not by plane, but by sailboat, both directions. The last chapter is focused on leaders who are connecting climate energy with housing, and Representative Ilhan Omar, another member of the squad, has really been a leader in calling out and connecting the housing crisis that we have. We have growing housing insecurity and homelessness, and there's very little discussion or plan for how to deal with this. And so she's calling for huge, massive public investments in housing. There's also an organization called Moms for Housing, which originated from a group of women in Oakland, California, who were homeless, and they and their children occupied a vacant home that a developer owned, so no one was living in it, and they started living there. And then when they were evicted, the officials sent really military style eviction troop to come with guns and tanks, and they turned that traumatic experience into this organization, the founding of this organization that really calls for housing as a human right, especially as we get more and more housing insecurity. there's just massive needs for public investment in housing. The last example here are some Indigenous women in Canada, the Tiny House Warriors, and they are linking their cultural association with housing and with the land as their home, with these tiny houses that they have built and they're living in, and they're on wheels, and they move their houses across the land to block the fossil fuel pipeline infrastructure that's being put in. And so they're using this idea of home and connecting it with resistance of fossil fuel infrastructure. So one thing when I was writing the book, I wanted to include a chapter about education, leaders that are connecting education with climate and energy in innovative ways. One of the leaders there is Jasmine Banks, who is the executive director of Uncoke My Campus, which reveals how much the fossil fuel industry has been influencing our higher education system. And I co-authored an op-ed with her about advancing racial justice means ending fossil fuel reliance, so kind of connecting fossil fuels with racial injustice. But I didn't, in the book, my editor advised against having a chapter about education because it seemed a little off topic in a sense. So that's kind of my next project. And I'm really interested in thinking more about education and the role of higher education in particular as either perpetuating the status quo or advancing transformation toward a more socially just and equitably prosperous society. So that's kind of interests looking forward. At Northeastern, I've been, as a faculty member, part of the Climate Justice Committee, where we passed a resolution asking the leadership of the university to make a commitment to climate justice. We're with mixed results, I guess. And I also just want to mention I'm part of a couple of other projects that we're working on. The Climate Social Science Network is a group of scholars who are really focusing on climate obstructionism and understanding the networks and legacy of those who have been resisting action on climate. And in that, I'm part of a working group on the fossil fuel industry's influence in academia. We're writing a paper about proposing a whole research agenda, very unresearched area. There's a lot of potential there. And with students at Northeastern, we're also writing a paper about climate justice in higher education. How can colleges and universities promote societal transformation? So the last chapter, I'll just end here and we can open it up for discussion. But the last chapter of my book is really a call to kind of inspire and motivate people to get involved in thinking about transformation and really thinking about our collective power for action. And I think the book talks about leadership, but I try to present leadership as we're all leaders and we can all act in ways to inspire other leaders. Leadership is not just CEOs of companies or elected officials, but we're all leaders in our communities, in our families, in the organizations where we work and contribute to. So there's lots of ways to be thinking about leadership as more of being engaged and taking initiative to really advocate for system change. And this is where a lot of discussions have been focusing on individual change, right? And we're all part of the system. But I think we've really done ourselves a disservice to some degree to focus too much on what each of us individually are doing, because we end up then feeling either, kind of discrediting other people for not doing the environmentally friendly thing or things like that. And I think we really need to move away from that and acknowledge that so many people don't have choices in what they do. And those of us who do have a choice, of course, it's fine and good if we make different choices, but we really need to be all engaging on this deeper systemic change and advocating for that. And that sometimes it involves, not being as committed or promoting always individual changes. The other point is, another point here is just about understanding and unlearning racism and sexism, talking about these problematic policies and practices and processes that we all, at so many levels of our systems, right, are all too often perpetuating privilege to some and disadvantaging others. And we all need to be kind of resisting that at every step. And part of that is acknowledging it and understanding it and talking about it and unlearning. Obviously, voting is a big one. We're here in the United States, it's getting harder and harder to vote in many places. So there's a lot there to be able to give these different kind of leadership a chance. We need participation in voting, of course. Another thing we can all do is get involved in innovations in local and distributed community renewable energy. And, again, we seem to talk a lot about technological innovation, but we spend less attention on social innovation and getting involved ourselves in cooperatives and different models of distributing power and structures and organizations, and are ways that we can all experiment and get involved and learn from these different models. Those of us who do research, we all have opportunities to leverage the data and science and information and mapping and all kinds of things to justify and help justify these more transformative changes. I like to mention Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and a climate justice leader internationally. She has said that these ideas, especially when you say feminist climate justice perspectives, might seem radical. But if you think about just kind of a people's first approach, what do people need? Where should we be investing? And you prioritize what people need. These ideas aren't as radical. And I end honoring also Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman to run for president in the United States in 1972. And she really has, paved the way for a lot of other people to come after her. And she, in some ways we've come a long way since 1972, but in other ways we're not as far as many people might have hoped or thought that we could have this far past this many decades later. So I will end there, and I will just mention that the book, all the author proceeds from this book go to NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. So if you are interested in buying the book, the proceeds go to advance some of this good work that is showcased in the book. So I will end there and look forward to the discussion.
That is excellent. Thank you, Jennie. And thank you for being so good with time as well. You made my job extremely easy there. That was an absolutely fascinating run through of, you really cover a remarkable amount of ground in that book, and that was told so accessibly as well. And I personally found it really fascinating to hear it in such fine-grained detail, what's going on in the United States, because you can imagine we only get the kind of more high-profile news from the US, which quite often isn't as hopeful as the picture that you've painted there. There's clearly a lot of activism at every scale, actually, which I found particularly interesting as well, which yes, could paint a slightly more hopeful picture of the future. I mean, I've really got a lot of questions. I was particularly struck by your description of the university that you're at from the outset, Northeastern, how that was a supportive environment, and the fact that you published with your students as well. So illustrating exactly that kind of leadership, actually, which I thought was really valuable. So I really do have many questions and could go on for a while. If people want to either put up their hands, I think Pete will help me coordinate the putting up of hands, etc., or type their question in the chat, and then I can either call on you or read the question out. I will ask one question just while people are having a think, and it's really to understand a bit more about the US context. I'm wondering how much this is also a Republican-Democrat divide. I think I'm right in saying that I really like the way that you went between kind of national level politicians who are doing this work and also local initiatives, precisely problematizing that kind of scale, I think. But are there also, for example, people in the Republican Party who are also involved in, say, a local environmental initiative or climate aware initiative or something like that? Or is it quite starkly Republican-Democrat divide?
Yeah, so I think, unfortunately, it is quite stark divide. What's happened, I think, and this kind of goes back to thinking about over the past few decades, how the climate issue and then associated with that energy has really been politicized in a very strategic way. So, 20 years ago, there were more Republican leaders who were talking about climate change and saying that we need to take action on climate. And that has actually been reduced, I would say, over the past few decades, and especially most recently, when the idea, and this is where the fossil fuel interests have been so effective in their cultural campaign to promote the idea that fossil fuels are essential for everything, and that climate isn't something we need to worry about. So that's become so politicized and so deep as a cultural belief system that it's not about better communication of the science or anything like that. It's really become an ideology. So it is quite divisive, and it gets even down to the local level. The division, and the United States is there's quite, as you know, probably it's very heterogeneous country, big country, a lot of different things going on in different places and very different complicated politics in the different places, but also some very consistent patterns. I actually had, it gets beyond climate, but even energy there's been kind of a association. I used to live out in the suburbs, and in the house we lived in, there were solar panels. We put solar panels on the roof, and I had a neighbor walk by and say, look up and see the solar panels. And he said, oh, I didn't know those things worked. I thought renewable energy, I thought it was a joke or a farce, or he didn't believe that renewable technology actually could provide energy. So, that just demonstrates some of the kind of depth of the cultural, as I said, I think it's been a quite strategic campaign by those who don't want the transformation. So anyway, those are some responses to that question.
No, it's really interesting. Thank you. We have a few questions coming up in the chat, and I can see that Peter and Georgia have their hands up. Georgia, would you like to go first? Or Peter, were you first? I'm not sure.
I think Peter was first.
I was first, but I think Georgia should go.
Okay.
Okay, I can do that. Thanks for that. So yeah, I have, thank you so much for the presentation. Super inspiring, and looking forward to actually looking into the book and reading the book. I have a couple of questions. Starting with the campaign that you mentioned that has been going on from the fossil fuel industry. I was wondering if that's something that is explicitly mentioned in the book, and we can learn more about like the investments that went into that and how it worked, and how that worked out. And then my second question, I was very intrigued as an academic myself into the topic of climate justice on higher education, both in terms of You showed a slide where you sent something, as I understand, to the rector maybe of the university, advocating for some change. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. But also you mentioned that you're doing some research on that, and I would just be curious to hear more about that.
Great. So your first question, yeah, chapter 2 of the book does give some overview of the networks of investments and the kind of scale and scope of what some people have called the Coke Octopus, because the Koch brothers are these fossil fuel billionaires who kind of developed this network of very strategic investments, some at the community level, and then they have established networks at different states where they also give politicians a whole playbook of like, try to promote this policy that makes it harder to deploy and invest in renewables. So there's like a whole complex network of things going on. And in the book, I really just kind of summarize some of that, but there's a lot of other really good work that several books have been written about it, and also just about that. And then there's new emerging research that's actually revealing some of that, right? From a social science research perspective, which is adding a lot to the awareness and understanding of how coordinated and how strategic they have been. So there's a lot there if you're interested in finding out more. Some references in the book, but there's also a lot of new research in that area as well. In terms of your second question about climate justice in higher education, we've been exploring this, both, I guess this is where I end up being quite holistic in my approach, right? Connecting dots between my teaching, my research, and then my service, I guess, to the university and to the profession in academia. So I've been thinking quite a lot about this, and I think there's really more and more of us are recognizing in our own universities how so many of the decisions are based on economics, and kind of this idea of financialization of higher education is coming up, and there's a lot to be critical of, I think, in our systems, and maybe I don't know all the systems in different countries, but in the United States, at least, it's compounded by deep student debt that students are getting into. So then they end up this cycle of debt that's associated with education, and there are a lot of things there to discuss. And so one of the things that we have tried at our university is, instead of having a climate action plan, which many universities have, it's kind of similarly to other with like goals of, by 2050, we want to have reduced this much, this kind of thing, which is the conventional thing that some universities have done. We've advocated to have a climate justice action plan, not just a climate action plan. And but then what that means, we're still kind of working on, but it really means expanding beyond the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and actually thinking about, like, how are we as a university perpetuating inequities, and how can we address the climate crisis internally and making some of those investments potentially in renewable energy and divesting from fossil fuels and those kind of things, while also acknowledging our practices and policies and priorities that are exacerbating inequities, economic inequities, our hiring practices in our universities, how we're giving back to the communities. In the United States, universities are, private universities are nonprofit organizations, so they actually don't need to pay tax in the cities so they are supposed to give like donations, almost charity back to the cities. It's called the pilot program, payment in lieu of taxes, but they give very little back to the communities. And so that's one of the kind of things that some of us are talking about, it like different ways of organizing our institutions that acknowledge, that could shift and have a bigger impact beyond the conventional way we think about education. But there's a lot of other ideas and in that space, and it's also very context specific with each university as well.
Excellent, thanks. Okay, we've got 2 questions that have come up in the chat, and then also a question from Kevin. But I think first in was a question from Elizabeth Clarkson. I can either read that out, Elizabeth, or if you want to turn on your camera and read it too. I'll start by reading it out, and maybe if you'd like to respond afterwards. But the question is, many people struggle to find the confidence to speak up in the climate change movement with the fear that they are not educated enough on all the topics to lead others. How did you begin to overcome this fear? And is it still something you still experience? I think that's a very interesting question, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Yeah, very important question. I think this is kind of one of the ideas that I try to get at in the book, that our sense that only the experts know, right? That we, and that's kind of to do with higher ed as well, and our, research, the prestige or something of being a researcher, and this idea that the climate experts know and the rest of us don't. But I think what's really important is that to acknowledge that we all are experiencing already, changes in the climate, our own experiences, our own perspectives, different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of experiences are all really important. So I think another point is that our focus on science and technology has disengaged people as well, because oh, I don't understand the science. Oh, I don't know how this technology works. So therefore I can't engage. And that also has diminished a sense of agency for people. And then the other part of the question, I think that is about the courage that it takes to talk about some of these issues. And that's something that I think over time I've kind of overcome, or built some more courage, not so much in content, but also it takes courage to challenge some mainstream ideas, and the powerful people who don't actually want to hear some voices, right? So there are multiple dimensions of that question, really important question. And I think personalizing and acknowledging these power dynamics and the social impacts is one way that is much more accessible for people to talk about. And hopefully that opens up avenues to engage more people.
Excellent. Okay, we've got one from Miguel, also in the chat. So Miguel, I can read that out as well, unless you want to jump in. But the question is quite a technical one. How do you see the recent pushes for nuclear, CCS, hydrogen, synthetic fuels, and other advanced tech fitting in these evolving power dynamics of the energy system?
Yeah, so I've actually worked quite a bit earlier in my career on carbon capture and storage as this mechanism, that a technology that kind of came on the scene as a way, and it actually brought some of the fossil fuel climate deniers to the table to say, oh, maybe we can still burn our fossil fuels and keep extracting fossil fuels and still mitigate climate change. So it allowed, some of these technologies have allowed the fossil fuel interests to acknowledge climate change and then start to engage on the issues. But I think this technocratic focus and all these different technologies, again, kind of leads us away from the societal transformation issues that and this energy democracy perspective, where the climate crisis, it's not just about reducing carbon emissions. And so while that the climate crisis is really an opportunity for these social justice issues to be prioritized. So I would also say that the technological perspective is kind of, for example, Bill Gates had a new book last year or just a few months ago, and he also spoke up about, I mean, he focuses on technology, right? It's all about technology, and he doesn't even acknowledge, he acknowledges that he doesn't even know about or understand the policies and the politics. And so I think it's really dangerous when we focus on these technologies without connecting with the social and political dimensions of them. So that's a general answer. Nuclear always comes up, and there's some diehard nuclear people who think that nuclear is the answer. There's a lot of risks of it, and it doesn't involve any societal transformation whatsoever. So in that sense, it doesn't offer the same opportunities. And as one of my colleagues likes to say, building more nuclear right now, since we haven't developed a way to deal with nuclear waste, is like building apartment buildings without any toilets, which we wouldn't do. So yeah.
Excellent. That was a really, that made me think, your comment about Bill Gates there made me think of Elizabeth's question as well. Who has the confidence to speak about this? If Bill Gates doesn't know anything about the technology, but still has the confidence to talk about it, I think that says quite a lot about who has the confidence to talk about this. But I think Kevin is next up. He's got his hand up.
Sorry, I just need to plug in my computer because I'm low on battery, so I'm listening. Go ahead, I just need to go out.
All right. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for putting on this event, Peter and the team, and thanks, Jenny. I really enjoyed your talk, particularly about the different leadership styles and styles of governance, and not to mention objectives that we see in your dichotomy. Anyway, so for a question. Going back to the point about intersectionality, I realize that you can only do so much. You define your project, but I was just wondering a couple of things. One was to do with how would the inclusion of how would these sorts of things affect your analysis? Do you think? Can you conjecture? So indigenous voices in the US and North America, voices from the global South, and indigenous voices from the global South. So that was one thing that struck me, but then something else, which I think is really interesting, also coming from intersectionality, the idea of intersectionality is that Greta is not neurotypical. And, I think that's really interesting in terms of her analysis of the situation and the ways in which she works with that. And I do quite a lot of, I'm quite involved in sort of disability stuff myself. And so, the people that I know in that world, what's happening is absolutely, it's impossible to understand. It is so bonkers the way in which things are. And it just seems to me, the point is that this doesn't come from a kind of naivety or a lack of understanding. It comes from a very different and special way of understanding. And I just wonder if you came across examples of this sort of thing in your work, that go beyond the very significant example of Greta.
Yeah, well, thank you. Sorry, weird echo. Okay. Thank you for that. And I appreciate that very much. So the idea of diversifying power, which is what the title of the book is about, is exactly to that point about the diversity brings such richness, right? The diversity of perspectives that different people bring based, again, not just on their race and gender, but on their sexuality, on their, as you mentioned, different disability. on there, and the idea here, what I try to point out is that what we need to be acknowledging is that when women, people of color, indigenous folks, others who've been marginalized or historically left out, including people with disabilities, when we have a seat at the table, or we are included in decision making, we bring different experiences, different perspectives, different priorities, and different perceptions of risk. And I think that there's been research on risk perceptions that shows what they call the white male effect. White men, and this is in the United States, and generalizations, of course, but on average, white men think everything is less risky than people who are not white or people who are not men. So this perception of risk and this different way of viewing the world, and as you pointed out with Greta, just the clarity by which it doesn't make sense why things are the way they are. And the way she's been able to describe that in such, that's exactly why I think she's had so much impact, right? So I think that's really important. The other thing that I like to point out is that when I talk about anti-racist feminist leadership, it's really an invitation for all of us to consider ourselves anti-racist and feminist, and when I say that, I mean we don't want just people of color considering themselves anti-racist and standing up for dismantling structural racism. We don't want only women having to stand up all the time for gender equity, right? We need everybody to be aware of these and challenging and restructuring things, and similarly, when it's not just about race and gender, and I think that gets to your question, the intersectionality. When I define anti-racist feminist leadership, that involves leadership that understands these problematic power dynamics that would also hold true for LGBTQ and disability, and full spectrum of different kinds of diversity and marginalization of whole categories of people, and that's what I'm trying to get at. So it's not, and class. It's not just race and gender. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for reminding me about Paul Slovic and his psychometrics, the white man thing. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jenny.
Okay, we have a question from Lavanya Gupta. I don't know if you want to ask it, Lavanya. It's quite a complicated question. I can read it out as well.
Yes, ma'am, you can read it out actually.
Okay, I'll read it out. Yeah. Okay. When we talk about access, Lavanya's question is about access to renewable energy. And she points out it's highly variable over urban and rural space. So how do you see leadership building up in rural societies, especially from the perspective of gender? Women are generally marginalized and have low access and knowledge about renewable energy. And do you have any cases like that in your book or any examples? I think that's very interesting, Lavanya, because that will vary greatly across the world. And I think in the States, that might be part of the Republican-Democrat divide. I don't want to oversimplify that, but
yeah, so there is a big rural-urban divide that's associated with or correlated with some of the party divide. I think, Kate, is what you're referring to. But Lavanya, to your question, I think, the same ideas hold true, right, and priorities regardless of the urban rural, and I think in the United States, at least, we've done some of my research team did some research. We did some research showing that renewable energy, you know, when a community benefits from the renewable energy, that's when there's it's kind of good for everybody, right? And so I think the challenge, or I think what you're asking about is mechanisms by which to deployed and benefiting. And so some of the examples in, I guess, is thinking about like with wind turbines in the United States. What was found is that, you know, when farmers are paid for using their land to put up a wind turbine, then it's seen as an economic development. It has some benefit to the farmers. And then it can be kind of accepted widely and expanded. So I think, but then there's also resistance in some rural communities to renewable installations, particularly if nobody locally is benefiting, right? Especially some of these large scale renewable installations. Sometimes a developer comes in, buys the land, and sometimes uses agricultural land for energy. And, you know, that's when there definitely can be contention in rural communities. So those are some of the examples that I'm familiar with in the United States context, but maybe if you want to elaborate about the gender dynamic that you're interested in, or tell us more about your interests in this.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Basically, I'm from India. So there are few organizations which are working over renewable energy with rural women. One is related in very famous, it's related with the bee wax system and solar energy in Rajasthan. So I was thinking that you might have some cases in rural areas with social enterprises and cooperatives who are working with rural women and trying to, you know, empower them. To let them know that renewable energy is the source that you should use right now. Because in India it is getting subsidized at very lower rates to promote clean energy initiative. So yeah, that is why I was asking that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Question there. Excellent. Okay, are there any more questions? I think Pete, you had a question as well. Or it's okay. Don't worry. Our technical master has technical issues. Yeah, don't worry about it.
Can you hear me?
I was wondering. Yes, now we can.
Okay, I'm sorry. So my Zoom is freezing pretty badly right now, and I'm not entirely sure what the issue is, which may actually have been the cause of some of the issues earlier. So I'm trying to respond to Emma. I'm sorry, Emma, if you're still here, we will be posting the recording to this online on our website, which is www.energygeographies.org, provided, of course, that this does actually record and doesn't glitch out entirely. So I'm going to let somebody else ask questions. I'm going to try and sort this so we don't lose the recording. But Jenny, thank you very much. And I've got loads of questions. I just need to make sure that we don't lose this. Okay.
I'm going to ask a question then, because I'm chair and I get to. I'm wondering about, because of course we've got COP coming up, and I gather you're travelling to Glasgow tonight. And I'm really struck by this idea of the polluter elite, and you're very specifically talking about the Koch brothers and the fossil fuel industry and the connections with the US government there as well, or like transnational governance. But I saw on the news a couple of days ago that something that's going on in Glasgow is that so some of the high-profile political women, so for example, I think it was Kate Middleton, was being praised for wearing the same outfit twice, or like an outfit that had been worn at another event, because this shows that they're illustrating the importance of like recycling and reusing rather than buying a new outfit. And that struck me. I'm quite interested in clothes in general, and so that struck me as really quite an example of how maybe like even the more progressive discourses are being captured by an elite that wouldn't necessarily open up, even though they might be quite pro a green agenda. It's not going to be the kind of green agenda that you're talking about in your book, Jenny, like that kind of more diversified power. Because of course, I think it's fair to say that poor people have figured out that you can wear things more than once, like, you know, those kind of strategies kind of thing. What do you see as the dangers of, you know, maybe the successes that we're seeing in climate change? As in, it is top of the agenda, there are these international conferences, but nevertheless, that means, you know, the way that crises and power works, that means that traditional elite power is also represented as part of that. What do you see as the kind of opportunities and dangers in these conferences of that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, well, thank you. So there's a lot of observations I could make here. I think one of the things that I'm feeling or sensing, and I've actually attended, this will be my third COP in attendance. I was in Copenhagen, which kind of ended badly in that people are hoping for a more aggressive and commitments than what happened. And then in Paris, there were the commitments that were made. And then, but what's with the, you know, the insufficiency of the action is becoming more and more clear, I think. And ultimately, what really needs to happen is, I think, and it's becoming more mainstream in the discourse and in the discussion, is leave fossil fuels in the ground. Like somehow we have to get to a place where we collectively agree that that is the goal, that needs to be the goal, not all these other things. I mean, obviously emissions, the focus on emissions is a piece, but it shows, it, you know, it doesn't get to the root and the insufficiency of where we need to go versus where we are. So I think what I was starting to say is that it's going to get harder and harder and more divisive, and I think more contentious, because as we get closer to, you know, in some sense, the polluter elite, the fossil fuel interests are going to dig in even harder and stronger, right? And then the youth and the activists who are going to get more angry and take even bigger measures. I think the protests are going. I mean, I don't know. I'm not hoping for violence or anything, but I think that everything's just ramping up on both sides almost, and I think it's getting more contentious. So these kinds of examples that you mentioned about clothes, or how the elite are perceived, or different people who have power in the conversation or influence, I think also will get more critical, right? Like people can kind of laugh or make fun of that kind of an example, like, oh, just because you didn't buy a new dress, like, you know, that's, but at the same time, you know, it elevates the conversation in a different way. So, so I don't know. I think there's just, I think we're in a different. It's evolving quickly, and I think we're getting in a different phase, in a sense. And we can't ignore these issues anymore. And I mean, I think that's part of the value of these annual conferences, is that the world kind of looks for 2 weeks and it's top of the headline, right, for a few weeks, and then so that brings some mobilization and energy to the conversations, and it brings a dynamicness to it too as well. So you know, there's a lot changing quickly, and I think with the pandemic, it's revealed even more of the stark inequities and how we're not good at global governance. We can't even, you know, distribute the vaccine, let alone, you know, coordinate this transformation that we need. So it's a challenging situation, but and I think there's a lot of different moving parts that are going to be bubbling up.
I've no doubt. Yes, I've just seen we've got another question from Martin Sokol. It's quite a short one, so I'll just read it out, Martin. And if you want to come back, then you can come back after the response. But sometimes the resistance to clean energy transformation is that it will cost us too much, i.e. where will we find the money to pay for it? What would be your response to that?
Yeah, so that's an easy one in a sense, that, you know, the cost of not doing it is going to be much higher, right? And that's becoming more and more evident as, well, in the United States, at least, cities, states are increasingly having to pay for all kinds of climate impacts, whether it be wildfires, droughts, floods, heat waves, and so that's one argument, and then the other is tax the billionaires, right? And that, you know, literally it's only a handful of people that could pay for all of this, so it doesn't have to impact everyone negatively, and that's, you know, obviously that's hard to do because the billionaires have a lot of power and they don't want to be taxed. So, but that's the other way to pay for it.
Just following up from that, actually, 'cause it's someone described the current climate debate to me a while ago as basically finance versus oil, like, so because the insurance companies don't want to make those payouts, and Mark Carney just announced a significant, so the former head of the Bank of England just announced a very significant, I can't remember the exact number, but in the hundreds of billions kind of international level investment in climate change. How do you see that panning out? Because obviously it's not an anti-capitalist, you know, or societal transformation that they're suggesting there. So how do you see that panning out? If Jennie can still hear me. Yeah.
In this COP, and they have been throughout, right? Like finance issues have been really, you know, really important, and a lot of the contention, and also where pledges have been made and then not followed through. So that can happen again. So I don't know how it's all going to unfold. There's this science fiction book called The Ministry of the Future that projects only about five or 10 years out from now, a whole reimagining of our finance system, and that that we won't make the changes until the banks get involved, and they are central to the transformations. So it's an area that, you know, I think we should all be paying more attention to for sure. And I don't know how it's all going to pan out, but yeah, great question.
Excellent. And what will you be doing in Glasgow? Like, what's your?
Yeah, so I'm part of a delegation for a DC-based organization called the Global Council for Science and Environment, and I actually just joined the delegation last week because someone else couldn't go, so I wasn't planning to go, but they had an extra badge and they had all the plans organized, and they're representing, they're advocating for, they represent universities, so they're very interested in the university networks and advocating for science and social science research to be integrated into policy, and then I'm also going to be on a panel with the Climate Social Science Network, which is a group of social scientists that is studying the climate obstructionism. And so that talking about, the title of that panel is Understanding the Networks of Climate Obstructionism. So that is on Thursday of next week. So that's what I know about so far. I think there may be some other things that come up in my agenda, because it's quite seems quite a little bit hectic and things shifting and moving, and so those are some of the things I'll be doing. And then we're trying to connect with, there's a university network, a global network of universities that is going to be there. There's some sessions that I'll be attending related to that. So I'm hoping to, advance my thinking as well on this idea that I mentioned of like the role of higher education in all of this.
Yeah, that's really struck me throughout your talk, is the way that you've reflected on the role of the universities from the outset. I think that's crucial. Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, I think that's quite a good note to end on. I hope your flight goes well to Glasgow. I hope you enjoy the food and the weather, which is always a bit of a risk coming to the UK, really. But yeah, and we're just down the road if you need an escape. Northumbria isn't far either. But yeah. I can't thank you enough. That was such a fascinating talk. It was so accessible. You've answered all these questions in such detail, and I think it's really, I think it's really given. It's made me feel a little bit more hopeful. I mean, I really do. Sometimes just cannot stand it any longer, kind of thing. But like those examples that you gave, I think it's really crucial to remember that those local examples are bound. It's not even, they're bound in with what's happening at a national level as well. So really grateful. Thank you so much. I'm sure people can be in touch either with me, Pete, or Jennie yourself if they have any further questions or would like to know any more details about the book. Yep. You'll have seen that Pete at the beginning, he put in more details of the upcoming seminars. We have one every week, which is quite an intense schedule actually. And next Friday it's going to be Joy Clancy talking about how have we got the measure of gender and energy. I'll be there as well. But
we look forward to seeing that. I think you can hear me now, right?
Is that Pete? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. We look forward to seeing you all there. Jennie, I'm sorry that I've kind of not been very present here and that we've had a few technical issues. But thank you. This has been an absolutely fantastic talk. Really appreciate it and really, really interesting.
Well, thank you for having me, and great. Thanks for coming to everyone.
Great.
Yeah,
okay.
good luck next week. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Bye.
Thank you.